My name is Elena Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and for 12 years I've worked as a hospice nurse in Portland, Oregon. Spending my days with people who know time is limited changes the way you look at ordinary conversations. You start paying attention to the things people don't say. The pauses. The unfinished sentences. The papers they keep folded in a bedside drawer. That's probably why one sentence from my husband stayed with me longer than it should have. "I'll marry you," he said, sliding a thick envelope across the polished restaurant table. "But I'm not risking my future." Inside was a prenuptial agreement. Not a simple one. Nearly 70 pages. His attorney had highlighted the signature lines with yellow tabs. I looked at the stack of paper while the candles between us burned lower. Around us, people laughed over anniversary dinners. Waiters carried bottles of wine. Someone celebrated a birthday near the window. Across from me sat Nathan Carter, 38 years old, founder and CEO of a healthcare software company worth more money than I had ever imagined earning. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. He sounded like he was discussing insurance. "I've built everything from scratch," he said quietly. "I can't afford emotion to interfere with business." I remember folding my napkin before answering. "I understand." His shoulders relaxed immediately. He smiled. That should have been my first question. Why did relief arrive faster than love? I didn't know it then. Years later, I discovered that the prenup wasn't really meant to protect his future. It was meant to hide someone else's past. But I had no way of knowing that while I reached for the pen. Before I tell you what happened, I'd like to ask you something. If stories about family, trust, and the quiet truths people spend years hiding interest you, I'd appreciate you subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Sometimes strangers notice things our own families never do. Now, it started almost a year before the wedding. Nathan and I met during one of the hardest weeks of my career. One of my hospice patients had passed away after months of treatment. His family thanked every nurse personally before leaving the facility. Nathan happened to be there visiting his aunt, who volunteered twice a week reading novels to patients. He noticed that I stayed behind after everyone left. "You always organize the room afterward?" he asked. "It helps the next family." He nodded as though he understood exactly what I meant. Most people don't. Over the next few months, we kept running into each other. Coffee shops, community fundraisers, hospital charity dinners. Nothing dramatic. Just enough coincidences to become conversations. Nathan listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was usually about systems, efficiency, planning, long-term thinking. He treated life like a business strategy. Oddly enough, I found it calming. After spending every day watching unpredictable illnesses change people's lives overnight, someone who believed everything could be planned felt steady. 6 months later, he proposed during a quiet weekend on the Oregon coast. No photographers, no audience, just wind, gray waves, and a simple ring. I said yes before he even finished asking. 3 weeks later, he asked me to dinner. That's when the envelope appeared. I read every page, every clause, every exception. If we divorced, I would leave with only what I personally earned. No claim to company shares. No investment growth. No real estate purchase through his business. Nothing unexpected. It wasn't romantic, but it wasn't unreasonable either. At least, that's what I told myself. As a nurse, I'd watched families destroy each other over estates worth far less than Nathan's company. Maybe he was simply cautious. Maybe wealthy people had to think differently. When I finished reading, I signed every page without negotiating a single word. Nathan stared at me for several seconds. "You didn't even ask your lawyer." "I trust my own judgment." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I knew I was marrying the right woman. I smiled. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't watching me sign. He was watching to see whether I would ask about one paragraph buried near the end. I never did. And that overlooked paragraph would eventually unravel everything I believed about his family. When people hear that my husband was a CEO, they usually imagine private jets, glass offices, and expensive parties. Nathan did own the glass office. The rest never interested him. He drove the same dark blue SUV for years, wore plain navy suits, and preferred making coffee at home instead of stopping at cafes. He believed habits revealed character. Expensive habits, he often said, usually revealed insecurity. That was one of the reasons I fell in love with him. Or, at least, that's what I believed at the time. About a month after I signed the prenup, Nathan invited me to meet his family over Sunday dinner. "I should warn you," he said as we drove across town. "They're opinionated." I laughed. "So, is every family?" He smiled, but only briefly. "You'll see." The Carter home sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. It wasn't a mansion. In fact, it was surprisingly ordinary, a two-story brick house with neatly trimmed hedges and a porch swing that looked older than I was. Nathan parked in the driveway but didn't get out immediately. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt. Then he looked at the house for several seconds. "You okay?" I asked. "Just preparing." That answer stayed with me longer than I expected. People usually prepare for job interviews or court dates, not Sunday dinner. Inside, the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the hallway. Family photographs covered almost every wall. Graduations, birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings. There was something comforting about them, and something strangely incomplete. I couldn't explain why. As a hospice nurse, I'd learned that family pictures often told two stories. One showed who was present. The other quietly revealed who wasn't. I noticed several large gaps in the timeline. Pictures from Nathan's childhood, then almost nothing through his late teens. Then suddenly business awards in his late 20s. I filed that away without mentioning it. Nathan's mother greeted us first. "Lydia Carter," she said, hugging me warmly. "I've heard wonderful things." She was 64, a retired elementary school principal with perfectly organized silver hair and a voice that somehow sounded gentle and authoritative at the same time. Within 5 minutes, I understood how Nathan had become so disciplined. His father, Richard Carter, was 67. He had spent nearly 40 years as a commercial real estate attorney before retiring. Richard shook my hand instead of hugging me. "Any woman who can tolerate my son deserves respect." Nathan smiled politely. It didn't quite reach his eyes. Nathan also had a younger sister, Claire, 32. She managed marketing for a luxury retail company and carried herself with effortless confidence. She hugged Nathan quickly before turning toward me. "So, you're the famous Elena." "I don't know about famous. You've certainly made my brother interesting again." She laughed. Nathan didn't. Then there was Claire's husband, Ethan, an architect with an easy smile and an obvious talent for keeping conversations comfortable whenever they became awkward. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Lydia asked about my work. Richard discussed local politics. Claire talked about renovating their kitchen. Nathan mostly listened. That surprised me. At work, I was used to confident physicians leading every conversation. Nathan led board meetings with hundreds of employees. Yet around his family, he became quieter, almost careful. Halfway through dinner, Lydia placed another piece of chicken onto Claire's plate. "You always forget to eat." "I'm 32, Mom. You'll always be my little girl." She smiled warmly. A few minutes later, I reached for another dinner roll. Lydia glanced at the basket. "Oh, we're almost out." She set it beside Claire instead. It was such a small thing. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But observing tiny shifts in attention was part of my profession. Hospice families often revealed years of history through ordinary gestures. Who adjusted the blanket? Who avoided eye contact? Who received second helpings without asking? Nothing dramatic happened that evening. Only patterns. Claire interrupted people constantly. No one corrected her. Nathan waited until everyone else finished speaking before saying anything. No one invited him back into the conversation. Richard praised Claire's recent promotion for nearly 10 minutes. When Nathan's latest company expansion came up, Richard simply nodded. Good. Then, he changed the subject. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't affection either. It was something quieter. Something practiced. On our drive home, I finally asked, "Has Claire always been the favorite?" Nathan kept his eyes on the road. "I thought you might notice." "I wasn't trying to." "I know. After a long silence, he gave a small shrug. Families develop habits. Does it bother you? It used to. And now? He looked out at the rain beginning to fall across the windshield. I've learned that some battles cost more than they're worth. I accepted that answer, at least for a while, because over the next several months, I noticed something even stranger than Lydia's favoritism. Every time money entered the conversation, everyone in Nathan's family looked at Richard, as if they were waiting for permission. And during one quiet afternoon, while helping Lydia organize old paperwork in her study, I accidentally opened a drawer that someone had forgotten to lock. Inside was a thick manila folder with my name written across the front. I didn't open the folder.
Not then.
Even now, when I think back to that afternoon, I'm still surprised by my own restraint. The drawer had stuck halfway when I tried to close it. I was helping Lydia organize years of household paperwork while she searched the attic for old tax records Richard wanted. The folder sat neatly on top of several legal files, and across the tab, in careful block letters, was written, Elena Brooks, not Carter.
Brooks.
My maiden name. I stared at it for only a second before sliding the drawer shut. Then I stood there listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway.
Tick, tick, tick.
There are moments when curiosity feels justified. This wasn't one of them. At least, that's what I told myself. Lydia came downstairs carrying a dusty storage box. Found them, she said, smiling. I smiled back. Neither of us mentioned the drawer. On the drive home, I almost told Nathan. Almost. But something stopped me. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe years of sitting beside families during their hardest conversations had taught me that timing matters more than questions. I decided to wait. I should have noticed how often I was beginning to tell myself that. The months passed quietly. We planned the wedding. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony at a botanical garden overlooking the river. About 60 guests. Simple flowers. Live piano. No wedding planner. Nathan said he preferred spending money on our future instead of one afternoon. That sounded like him. We divided responsibilities naturally. I handled invitations and seating charts. Nathan dealt with contracts, insurance, and budgets. Everything had a spreadsheet. Everything had a deadline. Sometimes I teased him that he could probably organize a hurricane. He'd smile and reply, only if it stayed on schedule. Looking back, those were good days. Real ones. That's what makes the truth harder. Not every memory becomes false just because someone eventually lies. About 2 months before the wedding, Richard invited Nathan to lunch every Wednesday. It became routine. They never asked me to join. I didn't think much of it. Fathers and sons need their own conversations. Still, every Wednesday evening, Nathan came home quieter than usual. Not upset. Not angry. Just distant. He'd loosen his tie, make coffee even if it was already 7 at night, and spend an hour staring at financial reports on his laptop without really reading them. What does your dad want to talk about every week? I asked one evening. Nathan kept scrolling through the screen. Business. I thought he retired. He did. So, he still has opinions. That was the end of the conversation. Or at least he made sure it was. At work, I noticed similar patterns in different families. Adult children visiting aging parents. Old roles refusing to disappear. Some fathers never stopped being supervisors. Some sons never stopped asking permission. Richard wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His influence filled rooms without raising his voice. Then there was Claire. She called Lydia almost every day. Sometimes twice. She borrowed kitchen appliances she already owned. Dropped by unexpectedly. Asked Richard to review every financial decision, even though Ethan was perfectly capable of managing their finances. Everyone treated it as normal. I wondered if I was simply seeing a close family, or something more dependent. One Saturday afternoon, Nathan and I helped his parents clean their garage. Boxes were stacked everywhere. Old bicycles. Christmas decorations. College textbooks. Richard believed nothing should be thrown away until absolutely necessary. As we sorted through shelves, I found a faded cardboard box labeled simply, House Documents. I'll bring these inside, I said. Richard turned around faster than I'd ever seen him move.
No.
The word came out sharper than intended. He cleared his throat. I mean, those are already organized. I was just helping. I know. He walked over and took the box from my hands. I'll handle it. It lasted less than 10 seconds. But everyone went quiet. Even Claire. Then Lydia clapped her hands lightly. Who wants lemonade? Conversation restarted almost instantly. Too quickly. People only change the subject that fast when everyone already understands why. I noticed Ethan watching Richard. Not with surprise. With recognition. As if he'd seen that reaction before. Later, while Nathan loaded tools into the SUV, Ethan joined me near the driveway. He handed me a bottle of water. Getting used to the family? I think so. He smiled politely. It takes time. You've been around almost 8 years. I have. And his smile faded just enough for me to notice. Some questions answer themselves. Before I could ask what he meant, Claire called his name from the porch. He apologized and walked away. I watched him go. Hospice nursing teaches you to recognize people carrying invisible weight. Ethan carried it well. Too well. A week later, I finally mentioned the folder I'd seen. Nathan looked up from his laptop. What folder? In your mother's study. His expression changed so subtly that someone else might have missed it. His fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. Did you open it?
No.
He nodded once. Good. Why would your parents have a file with my name on it? It's probably wedding paperwork. My maiden name? They're attorneys' children at heart. He forced a small smile. They label everything. It sounded reasonable. Reasonable enough that I almost believed him. Almost. Because 3 days later, Lydia called to apologize for something she insisted was just a misunderstanding. The strange part wasn't the apology. It was that I had no idea what she thought she had done. And before I could ask, she whispered one sentence that made the folder impossible to forget. I hope Richard moved it before anyone else saw it. I'm sorry, I said into the phone. Moved what? There was a pause. Long enough that I pulled the phone away from my ear to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Lydia cleared her throat. Oh, nothing important. You just mentioned Richard moving something. I was talking about old insurance papers. Her answer came too quickly. I must have confused you. Before I could ask another question, she changed the subject. How's work? I answered automatically, but my mind never left those few seconds of silence. When we hung up, I stood in my apartment kitchen staring at the mug of tea I'd forgotten to drink. The steam had disappeared. The surface had already gone cold. Little things like that always reminded me how quickly time slipped away when your thoughts settled somewhere else. I should have let it go. Instead, I began paying closer attention. Not investigating. Just noticing. That's different. At least it was in the beginning. The wedding was only 6 weeks away. Life became wonderfully ordinary. Guest confirmations. Cake tastings. Final dress fittings. Nathan spent late evenings reviewing contracts while I answered messages from relatives asking about hotel recommendations. Sometimes we'd laugh over the smallest details. Whether the chairs should face the river. Whether my aunt would complain about the music. Whether his college roommate would accidentally tell embarrassing stories during the reception. For a while, everything felt normal again. Then came Lydia's birthday. Richard planned a dinner at their house. Just immediate family. Nathan and I arrived with flowers. Claire brought an expensive bottle of wine. Ethan carried homemade cheesecake. The evening started peacefully. Richard grilled steaks in the backyard. Lydia arranged candles across the dining table. Claire complained about traffic. Nathan quietly fixed a loose cabinet hinge without anyone asking. That was another thing about him. Whenever conversations became uncomfortable, he found something practical to do. Fix a chair. Wash dishes. Carry boxes. Movement gave him somewhere to place emotions. Dinner lasted nearly 2 hours. The conversation drifted from travel plans to local elections, then to rising home prices. Eventually, Richard leaned back in his chair. You know, he said, looking at Nathan, your company valuation has nearly doubled. Nathan nodded. So I've heard. You should think about expanding overseas. I'm considering it. Richard smiled. Good. Then he looked directly at me. And Elena, I assume you've become familiar with the prenup. The table became noticeably quieter. Yes, I answered. I read all of it. Excellent. He cut another piece of steak with deliberate care. People often misunderstand those agreements. I didn't. They protect families. Nathan shifted slightly in his chair. Dad. Richard held up one hand. I'm simply making conversation. No one spoke for several seconds. Claire reached for her wine glass. Ethan studied his plate. Lydia folded her napkin into perfect squares. It struck me that everyone at the table had practiced this silence before. Then Richard smiled again. You signed without requesting changes. I did. Interesting. I wasn't sure whether it was a compliment or a test. I trusted Nathan. Richard nodded slowly. Trust is valuable. His eyes remained on mine. So is documentation. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Nathan stood. I'll help clear the table. I've got it, Lydia replied. No, Nathan said gently. I need to stretch my legs. I followed him into the kitchen carrying empty plates. The faucet ran while he rinsed them one by one. Neither of us spoke until the dining room voices became muffled. Finally, I asked quietly, why does your father keep bringing up the prenup? Nathan kept looking at the sink. He thinks legal paperwork solves everything. Does it? He gave a tired smile. It solves less than lawyers like to admit. Before I could respond, Claire walked into the kitchen. Mom wants dessert. Nathan dried his hands. We're coming. As he walked past me, he whispered so quietly I almost missed it. Don't ask questions tonight. I watched him leave. That sentence bothered me far more than Richard's comments. Nathan had never told me not to ask questions. Not once. When we returned to the dining room, Lydia was lighting the birthday candles. Everyone gathered around. Richard stood beside her. Claire reached for her phone to take pictures. Nathan stood slightly behind everyone else. The candles flickered. Lydia smiled. I don't need anything special this year. Richard laughed softly. You already have everything. She looked around the table. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she said one sentence that changed the entire evening. I just wish your grandfather had updated his will before he died. The room froze. Not dramatically. Quietly. Richard's smile disappeared. Nathan looked down. Claire's hand stopped halfway to the cake knife. Even Ethan slowly lowered his fork. No one answered. Lydia blinked, as if she hadn't realized what she'd said. Then she whispered, I shouldn't have mentioned that. Richard stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the hardwood floor. Enough. Only one word.
Calm.
Controlled. Absolute. A few minutes later, dinner ended much earlier than planned. As Nathan and I drove home through steady rain, neither of us spoke for almost 20 minutes. Finally, I asked, why would your grandfather's will matter now? Nathan kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. It shouldn't, but it clearly does. He didn't answer. Streetlights reflected across the wet windshield in long golden streaks. Then, without looking at me, he quietly said, there's something about my grandfather's estate that my family has never agreed on. I waited. He didn't continue. Instead, he whispered something that felt less like an explanation and more like a warning. If anyone ever offers you old family documents, don't sign anything. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I thought I was in danger. Nothing that dramatic. I simply couldn't make the pieces fit together. The prenup, the folder with my maiden name, Richard's fixation on legal documents, Lydia's comment about the will, and now Nathan's warning. If anyone ever offers you old family documents, don't sign anything. People don't say things like that unless they've seen someone make a costly mistake. The next morning, I left for work before sunrise. The hospice wing was unusually quiet. Most of our patients were still asleep, and the hallways carried that familiar scent of coffee, disinfectant, and fresh linen. I liked arriving early. Hospitals tell the truth before visitors arrive. No televisions. No conversations. Just people doing the work. As I checked overnight notes at the nurse's station, my coworker, Melissa Grant, looked over her glasses. You look tired. I was at a family dinner. She laughed. That explains it. I smiled. Anyone who worked in hospice knew exactly what she meant. Illness wasn't always the hardest part. Families usually were. Around noon, during my lunch break, my phone buzzed. It was Lydia. Are you working? Yes. I'm sorry to bother you. It's okay. She hesitated. I was wondering if you could stop by this afternoon. Everything all right? I just found something that belongs to you. My first thought was the folder. I'll come after my shift. Thank you. She sounded relieved. Almost too relieved. Lydia's house felt different when I arrived alone. Without the rest of the family, it seemed quieter. The old clock in the hallway sounded louder. The hardwood floors creaked more than I remembered. She welcomed me with tea. Neither of us drank much of it. I've been cleaning the study, she said. I found these. She slid a small stack of papers across the table. They weren't legal documents. They were copies of the guest list from our wedding, receipts from the florist, hotel reservations. Nothing unusual. I thought these were what you meant. She frowned. What do you mean? When you called, you said you found something that belonged to me. I did. She looked genuinely confused. These are your copies. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she slowly realized what had happened. Oh. She looked down at the papers. I suppose I remembered wrong. It felt rehearsed. Not polished. Just redirected. I didn't press her. Instead, I asked the question that had been waiting since her birthday dinner. What did you mean about your father's will? Her fingers tightened around her teacup. I shouldn't have brought that up. Why? Because families survive longer when old arguments stay buried. Did someone contest the estate? She smiled sadly. You ask questions like a nurse. I am one.
No.
She shook her head gently. You ask questions like someone who's trying to understand people. That wasn't really an answer. Then the doorbell rang. Lydia looked surprised. I wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the front door. A man in his early 70s stood outside, holding a weathered leather briefcase. His gray suit looked expensive but old-fashioned. He removed his hat politely. Mrs. Carter. Harold. Her voice changed. Not frightened. Uncomfortable. I didn't know you were coming. I was in the neighborhood.
He noticed me. Oh.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company. Lydia introduced us. This is Harold Benson. He's been our family's attorney for a very long time. Harold smiled warmly. Long enough to remember Nathan riding bicycles through this neighborhood. He shook my hand. His grip was steady. You must be Elena. Yes. I've heard lovely things. Then his eyes rested on me for just a second longer than necessary. Recognition. Not introduction. Recognition. As though he'd expected to meet me eventually. Harold turned back to Lydia. I only need a few signatures. My attention immediately shifted. Signatures. Lydia glanced toward me. Perhaps another time. It won't take long. It should. Her answer surprised him. He nodded politely. Of course. As he opened his briefcase to return the documents, a thick envelope slipped onto the hardwood floor. Several papers slid halfway out. Before he could pick them up, I instinctively bent down to help. Years in nursing make quick reactions automatic. One page landed face up. I didn't mean to read it. My eyes simply caught the largest words on the page. Last will and testament. Beneath that, Arthur Carter, Nathan's grandfather. And below the title,
A date.
Only 6 months before Arthur's death. I remembered Lydia's words. I just wish your grandfather had updated his will before he died. But this document suggested he had. Harold quickly gathered the papers. Thank you. His smile never changed.
Neither did mine.
Lydia walked him to the front door. I remained in the dining room, staring at the empty place on the floor where the document had fallen. When Lydia returned, I asked quietly, I thought your father never updated his will. She stopped walking. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely frightened. She opened her mouth to answer. Before she could speak, my phone rang. It was Nathan. The moment I answered, he didn't say hello.
His voice was calm. Too calm.
Are you at my parents' house? Yes. I need you to leave. Why? There was a long pause. Then he said the last thing I expected. Because Harold Benson has no reason to be there today. I looked toward the front window. The attorney's car was still parked outside. And, through the glass, I watched Harold open his briefcase again, as if he were searching for one document he hadn't intended to lose. Nathan's words stayed in my ear, even after the line went quiet. Elena, I'm here. I need you to listen carefully. His voice had the same measured tone he used when explaining complicated decisions to his employees. It wasn't panic. It was precision. Leave now. You're worrying me. I know. Tell me what's happening. I can't over the phone. Is Harold dangerous?
No.
He answered immediately. Then why? Because if he's there today. He stopped himself. The timing is wrong. The call ended before I could ask another question. I slipped my phone into my bag and looked toward Lydia. She was standing in the hallway with one hand resting on the wall. You should go, she said softly. I was about to. I'm sorry. For what? She looked at me with tired eyes. For bringing you into a family that never learned the difference between protecting people and controlling them. Before I could respond, she walked me to the front door. Harold's sedan was already pulling away. No one mentioned the will again. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain had started again, leaving thin streams across the windshield. I drove without turning on the radio. Silence often helps me think. Hospice teaches you that answers usually appear after people stop talking. I replayed every conversation from the past year. Richard insisting documentation mattered. The mysterious folder. Nathan warning me not to sign anything. Lydia's fear. Harold's unexpected visit. None of those moments fit together. Yet somehow, they belong to the same puzzle. I just couldn't see the picture. Nathan was already home when I arrived. His laptop sat closed on the dining table. That almost never happened. He was making coffee. Fresh grounds. French press. Exactly the way he did whenever he had something difficult to discuss. You left work early. I took the afternoon off. He poured coffee into 2 mugs. Neither of us touched them. I saw Harold. I know.
How?
My mother called. So, she expected him. Nathan shook his head.
No.
Then why was he there? He leaned against the kitchen counter. I honestly don't know. That answer surprised me. Nathan rarely admitted uncertainty. What aren't you telling me? He looked toward the window before answering. When my grandfather died.
He stopped.
My father handled almost everything. The estate. Yes. You trusted him? I didn't think there was a reason not to. You've changed your mind. I have. I waited. He rubbed the side of his coffee mug with his thumb. My grandfather believed every decision should be documented. So did Richard. Nathan gave a faint smile. Exactly. What happened after Arthur died? My father said the estate had already been settled years earlier. And everyone accepted that? Mostly. What about Claire? She never questioned anything. And you? I was 30. He looked down. My company had just started growing. I was working 18-hour days. I didn't pay attention. His honesty felt genuine. It also left one obvious question. When did you start paying attention? Nathan met my eyes. About 8 months ago. The same time you asked me to sign the prenup. Yes.
A chill settled over me.
Those things are connected. They might be. Might. I don't have proof. I remembered something my patients often taught me. People usually say, I don't know, when they lack information. They say, I don't have proof when they already know the answer. That weekend, Ethan called unexpectedly. He asked if we could meet for breakfast. Just the 2 of us. Nathan encouraged me to go. He trusts very few people. Why me? Nathan hesitated. Because he thinks you'll notice things. It wasn't exactly comforting. Ethan chose a small diner overlooking the river. Nothing fancy. The waitress called everyone Han. Coffee arrived before we ordered. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. Work. The weather. Claire's latest home renovation project. Then Ethan folded his hands together. I owe you an apology. For what? I should have said something months ago. About our family. I stayed quiet. People reveal more when they aren't interrupted. He stared out the window. When Claire and I got married, Richard asked me to sign several documents. What kind? He said they were standard family planning papers. Did you read them? Every page. And they were mostly harmless. Mostly, there were a few clauses I didn't understand. Did you ask? I did. What did Richard say? He smiled. Ethan looked back at me and told me lawyers always include unnecessary language. That sounded familiar. Very familiar. Nathan had said almost the same thing after I mentioned the prenup. Not because he believed it, because someone else had taught him to say it. I filed that away. Ethan reached into his messenger bag. I want to show you something. He placed a thin manila envelope on the table. Unlike the one I'd seen in Lydia's study, this one had no label. I found these while cleaning our attic. Inside were photocopies, old bank statements, property tax receipts, several handwritten notes. Most meant nothing to me until I reached the final page. It was a photocopy of a cashier's check issued 18 years earlier. The amount was just over $2.8 million. The memo line read, "Distribution, Arthur Carter Estate. Payable to." I blinked and read it again. The recipient wasn't Richard. It wasn't Claire. It wasn't Nathan. It was a company I'd never heard of. Northridge Holdings, LLC. Whose company is this? I asked. Ethan slowly shook his head. That's the problem. I've spent 6 months trying to find out. He leaned forward slightly. I can't. I turned the page over. Nothing. No notes. No explanation. Just a photocopy. When did you find this? Last winter. Does Nathan know? No. Why not? Because before I could tell him. He paused. Someone broke into my home office. I looked up. They didn't take electronics. They didn't take cash. They ignored expensive watches. They took exactly one thing. The original copy of that check. A cold silence settled between us. Then Ethan quietly added, "And here's what frightens me most. I never told anyone I had it." I didn't touch the photocopy again. Instead, I folded it carefully and slid it back into Ethan's envelope. "You should keep this." He shook his head. "No. I've already made 3 copies. One is with my attorney. One is in a safe deposit box. And one," he pushed the envelope back toward me, "needs to be somewhere Richard would never think to look." I stared at it for a moment. You think he'd come after it? I think someone already did. There was a difference. Richard was a respected attorney. A careful man. Not someone who would smash windows or force locks. If Ethan was right, whoever entered his office had known exactly what they wanted. That suggested planning, not impulse. I slipped the envelope into my tote bag. I'll keep it safe. We left the diner separately. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about Northridge Holdings, LLC. Companies don't inherit estates. People do, unless the company belonged to someone. That evening, Nathan was in his home office reviewing quarterly reports. I placed the envelope on his desk without saying a word. He looked at the cashier's check. Then he stopped breathing for just a second. It was almost impossible to notice. Almost. "Where did you get this?"
Ethan.
He found it. Nathan read the document twice, then a third time. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "I've never seen this." "But you recognize it." "I recognize the amount." "You do?" He nodded slowly. "My grandfather used to mention setting aside one final investment." "What kind of investment?" He never explained. I assumed it was another property. He looked at the company name again. Apparently, I was wrong. "Do you know who owns Northridge Holdings?"
No.
He opened his laptop and typed for several minutes. Corporate records, business directories, archived filings. Nothing connected the company to the Carter family. Everything led to anonymous corporate registrations. "Someone buried this well," he said quietly. Then he looked at me. "I think it's time we hire our own attorney." 3 days later, we met Rebecca Sloan, a 46-year-old estate attorney Nathan's board chairman had recommended. Her office overlooked the Willamette River. Simple furniture. No unnecessary decorations. She reminded me of experienced nurses. confident without needing to prove it. Rebecca listened for nearly an hour, without interrupting. The prenup, the folder, Harold, the cashier's check, Richard's behavior. When we finished, she closed her notebook. I have one question. Nathan nodded. Go ahead. Who drafted your prenuptial agreement? Nathan answered immediately. My father's law firm. Rebecca didn't speak for several seconds. Then she asked another question. Did either of you have independent legal counsel? I felt my stomach sink.
No.
Nathan looked equally uncomfortable. Rebecca sighed. I wish you'd called me before signing. Is it invalid? Nathan asked.
No.
She chose her words carefully. But that's not what concerns me. What does? She opened a copy of the prenup Nathan had brought with us. Yellow sticky notes marked several pages. I spent last night reading every clause. She turned to the final section. Most of this document is standard.
She paused.
Except for one paragraph. The same paragraph Nathan had watched me ignore.
She pointed to it.
It was only 6 lines long. Ordinary legal language. At least, that's how it looked. Rebecca circled one sentence. This clause requires that if any previously undisclosed family assets are discovered after your marriage, both spouses agree not to contest any historical estate distributions already accepted by immediate family members. I read it twice, then a third time. The words finally settled into place. I looked at Nathan. This has nothing to do with divorce.
No.
Rebecca answered for him. It has everything to do with inheritance. The room fell silent. Rebecca continued. Whoever drafted this wasn't primarily protecting Nathan's company. They were protecting the outcome of an older estate. Nathan slowly closed the document. My father. Rebecca didn't answer.
She didn't need to.
That night, Nathan called his mother. He asked one question. Did Grandpa ever own North Ridge Holdings? Lydia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, Where did you hear that name? I need the truth. More silence. Then she quietly said, I always hoped you children would never find out. Nathan closed his eyes. Find out what? Lydia began crying.
Not loudly.
Just enough for us to hear through the speakerphone. Finally, she whispered, Your grandfather created that company because he stopped trusting your father. Neither Nathan nor I spoke. Lydia continued. He discovered money was disappearing. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. He didn't confront Richard. He hired another attorney, Harold. The name came to both of us at the same time. He planned to rewrite everything. Nathan's voice barely rose above a whisper. Did he? Yes. And then, Lydia took a slow breath. He died 6 weeks later. Nathan leaned forward. Was the new will ever filed? I don't know. You were there. I wasn't allowed in the meeting.
Who was?
Another long silence. When Lydia finally answered, her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. Only your father. And Harold. Before Nathan could ask another question, another voice suddenly came onto the line.
Calm.
Measured. Unmistakable. Richard. I think that's enough for tonight. Then the call disconnected. A few seconds later, Nathan's phone vibrated. A single text message. From Richard. If you continue digging, you'll destroy this family forever. Nathan read the text twice before locking his phone. He didn't delete it.
He didn't reply.
He simply placed the phone on the kitchen table and looked out the window. Rain had started again. It seemed to arrive every time our family conversations became difficult. I poured 2 cups of coffee. Neither of us touched them. What are you thinking? I asked. Nathan exhaled slowly. My father never threatens people. So this surprised you. It did. You think he's scared. Nathan looked at the message again. I think he's running out of explanations. I had spent enough years around grieving families to recognize another pattern. People protecting the truth usually invited questions. People protecting lies wanted the questions to stop. Richard wanted them to stop. That told me more than the text itself. The following morning, Rebecca called. I need both of you in my office.
Her voice was calm.
I found something. We arrived less than an hour later. A thick file sat on the conference table. Rebecca turned it toward us. I requested archived probate records yesterday. Were they helpful? Nathan asked. They were. She opened the file. Arthur Carter's estate was officially closed 14 years ago. I know. Nathan nodded. My father handled it. Rebecca slid another document across the table. So, explain this. It was a court filing dated nearly 6 months after the estate had supposedly been finalized. The title read, Petition to Amend Estate Inventory. Nathan frowned. I've never seen this. You weren't meant to. Rebecca tapped the signature page. The petition was withdrawn 48 hours after it was filed. Who withdrew it? She turned the page. Richard Carter. My eyes moved lower. Another signature appeared beneath his. Harold Benson. Nathan leaned back in his chair. So, they agreed. Rebecca nodded carefully. At least on paper. Can we find out why? I already did. She handed us another photocopy. A handwritten inventory. Several properties. Investment accounts. Art collections. Everything had neat checkmarks beside it. Everything except one line. North Ridge Holdings LLC. Next to it, someone had written in blue ink. Ownership disputed. Documentation pending. I stared at the note. Someone had expected more paperwork. Someone had known the estate wasn't complete. Nathan rubbed his forehead. My grandfather died before finishing it. Rebecca looked at him. Maybe. You don't think so? I think he finished something. She paused. I just don't think anyone wanted it filed. That afternoon, Nathan asked Lydia to meet us. Not at the family home. Not at our apartment. We met in a quiet public garden where people walked dogs and children chased ducks across the pond. Neutral ground. Lydia arrived carrying a small canvas handbag. She looked exhausted. I didn't sleep. Neither had we. Nathan didn't waste time. Mom. She nodded. Did Grandpa leave another will? She looked toward the pond. I never saw it. Did you know it existed? Yes. Who told you? She hesitated. Arthur. My heart skipped. He spoke to you before he died? 2 weeks before. She folded her hands tightly. He asked me to promise something. What? If anything ever happened before the paperwork was finished. She stopped speaking. Nathan waited patiently. He said the truth would eventually be inside the company. Nathan looked confused. The company? North Ridge Holdings. Lydia nodded. He said the documents would stay with the business. Rebecca had explained something similar earlier. Companies preserve ownership records differently than personal estates. If Arthur had transferred assets into North Ridge before his death, the evidence might still exist. Unless someone had removed it. Nathan asked the obvious question. Who inherited the company? Lydia slowly shook her head. I don't know. You never asked? I wasn't allowed. Nathan blinked. What do you mean? Your father said it wasn't my concern. For the first time since I'd met her, Lydia looked angry. Not loud. Not emotional. Simply tired of carrying someone else's decisions. I believed him. She looked at Nathan. I believed too many things. 3 days later, Rebecca called again. I've located the incorporation records. Nathan and I rushed her office. She spread certified copies across the table. North Ridge Holdings LLC. Formed 19 years earlier. Organizer. Arthur Carter. Managing member. Arthur Carter. Successor managing member. Rebecca looked directly at Nathan. Left intentionally blank. Nathan frowned. That's impossible. It isn't. Rebecca pointed to the filing instructions. Arthur planned to designate the successor later, but he died. Yes. So, who controlled the company afterward? Rebecca handed him one final document, an emergency court appointment signed less than 2 weeks after Arthur's funeral. Temporary manager. Richard Carter. Nathan stared at the page. Temporary. Rebecca nodded. Exactly. Temporary appointments require follow-up hearings. I know. There's no record of one. Silence filled the room. Then Rebecca quietly said, if no permanent transfer ever occurred. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Nathan looked at me, then back at the documents. If that's true, my father may have been managing assets he never legally owned. Before anyone could respond, Rebecca's assistant knocked on the conference room door. "There's someone here asking for Mr. Carter."
Who?
She looked uncertain. "He says he's Harold Benson." Rebecca frowned. "I don't have him scheduled." The assistant nodded. "I know. He said he only wants 5 minutes." Nathan slowly stood. "What does he want?" The assistant swallowed. He said, "It's time someone told you what really happened the night your grandfather died." Rebecca looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, Rebecca closed the file in front of her. "I'll stay." Nathan nodded. "I'd prefer that." A moment later, Harold Benson walked into the conference room carrying the same weathered leather briefcase I had seen at Lydia's house. He looked older than he had only a week earlier. Not physically, just tired. He removed his jacket and folded it carefully over the back of the chair. "I appreciate you agreeing to see me." Nathan remained standing. "You have 5 minutes." Harold accepted that without argument. "I've earned your anger." "You don't know what I've earned," Nathan replied.
No.
Harold lowered his eyes. "I suppose I don't." He opened the briefcase. Instead of legal files, he removed a small cassette recorder. The kind attorneys used decades ago, before digital recorders became common. Rebecca leaned forward. "What is that?" "Arthur Carter's final client meeting." Nathan frowned. "My grandfather recorded meetings?" Harold nodded. "Every estate conference." It was his habit. He placed the recorder gently on the table. "I never destroyed this one." The room became perfectly still. "I thought you said there wasn't another will," Nathan said. "I said it was never filed." "That's different." Harold looked directly at him. "Very different." Rebecca inserted the cassette into an old player she kept for archived evidence. The recording crackled before voices became clear. Arthur Carter's voice was older than I expected.
Weak.
Measured, but unmistakably sharp. "If you're listening to this," Arthur said, "it means something went wrong." The room fell silent. Another voice followed. "Harold's. You've asked that today's meeting be recorded." "Yes." Arthur answered. "I've changed my estate." Papers shuffled. Arthur continued. "My son Richard will temporarily oversee North Ridge Holdings." Nathan looked toward Rebecca. "Temporary." Exactly as the court records had shown. Then Arthur added the sentence none of us expected. "Temporary management is not ownership." I watched Nathan close his eyes. Arthur continued speaking. "When my grandson Nathan reaches the point where he can independently review the company's records, ownership transfers to him." My heart began racing. Arthur wasn't finished. "The company exists for one reason. To protect family assets from anyone, including my own children, if I ever believe those assets are being mismanaged." Nobody moved. Arthur spoke again. "I love my son." A long pause followed. "But I no longer trust his judgment." The recording ended with legal formalities. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No accusations. Just facts. Quiet facts. The kind that change lives. Nathan remained completely still. Finally, he asked the question everyone else was thinking. If this recording existed, why wasn't it presented after Grandpa died? Harold folded his hands. "Because I failed." Nathan stared at him. "I allowed Richard to convince me there would be another meeting. There wasn't. I believed the family needed peace." Rebecca spoke before Nathan could. "So you knowingly withheld evidence?" Harold nodded. "Yes. I've regretted that decision every day." "Why come forward now?" He looked at Nathan. "Because Richard asked me to destroy the recording last month." The room fell silent again. "I refused." "So he knew you still had it?" "Yes." "And that's why he visited my parents' house," I said. Harold looked at me. "He was trying to determine whether I'd already spoken to you." Everything suddenly fit together. The unexpected visit. The missing appointment. The nervousness. The carefully chosen words. Harold hadn't come to manipulate Lydia. He had come to decide whether it was finally time to tell the truth. Nathan stood and walked toward the window. For nearly a minute, no one interrupted him. When he finally turned around, his voice was calm. "I'm not interested in revenge." Harold nodded. "I know. I'm interested in accuracy." Rebecca smiled faintly. That's a much stronger position. Nathan looked at her. What happens now? She answered without hesitation. We petition the probate court to reopen the estate. Using this recording, the corporate filings, the temporary appointment, the cashier's check, and every document we've collected. Nathan looked toward Harold. Will you testify? Under oath. To everything? To everything. He didn't hesitate. Not once. The hearing took place 6 weeks later. There were no television cameras. No reporters. Just attorneys, court staff, and members of one fractured family. Richard arrived precisely on time. Dark suit.
Perfect tie.
The same controlled expression I'd seen since the day we met. Claire sat beside him, visibly confused. It became obvious she hadn't known the full story. Lydia sat alone behind them. Nathan held my hand briefly before we entered the courtroom. Then he let go. Not because he was nervous, because it was time to stand on his own. Richard testified first. He insisted every action had been taken to preserve the family estate. Every decision had been legal. Every document appropriate. Then Rebecca introduced the recording. Arthur's voice filled the courtroom. Temporary management is not ownership. Ownership transfers to my grandson Nathan. I no longer trust his judgment. No one interrupted. No one needed to. When the recording ended, Richard didn't argue with it.
He couldn't.
Instead, he quietly removed his glasses and placed them on the table. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked like an old man. Not a powerful attorney. Just an aging father whose decisions had finally reached their end. The judge requested a short recess before issuing preliminary findings. As everyone stood to leave the courtroom, Richard looked across the room at Nathan. His voice was barely above a whisper. I thought I was saving what your grandfather built. Nathan met his eyes. And somewhere along the way, you started believing it belonged to you. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. The evidence already had. The judge returned 23 minutes later. No one spoke while we waited. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence. Not the peaceful silence of a library. Not the uncomfortable silence of a family dinner. This one carries expectation. Every person in the room knows that once the judge begins speaking, life will divide itself into before and after. The ruling was measured. No dramatic language. No speeches. Only facts. The court found that Arthur Carter had clearly intended Northridge Holdings to remain separate from the rest of his estate until ownership could legally transfer. Richard's appointment had been temporary, and there was no evidence that it had ever been converted into permanent ownership. Because critical estate documents had never been properly presented, the judge ordered the probate matter reopened. An independent forensic accounting firm would review nearly 2 decades of financial records. Every transfer, every property, every distribution, every dollar connected to Northridge Holdings. The investigation would continue for months.
But one thing was decided that day.
Richard no longer had authority over the company. A court-appointed administrator would take control until everything was verified. Nathan didn't celebrate. Neither did I. Winning and healing are not the same thing. I learned that years before in hospice. Sometimes the correct outcome still leaves people grieving. The accounting review lasted almost 8 months. During that time, life became surprisingly ordinary again. I continued working at the hospice center. Nathan continued leading his software company. We stopped discussing the case over dinner. There were groceries to buy, laundry to fold, patients whose stories stayed with me long after my shifts ended. One evening, I came home to find Nathan repairing a loose kitchen cabinet. I laughed. You know, we could hire someone. I know. He tightened one last screw. But fixing small things reminds me that not every problem needs lawyers. It was the first time in months that I heard him joke. It felt like sunlight after a long winter. When the final forensic report arrived, Rebecca invited us to her office. The report filled 3 large binders. She summarized it in less than 5 minutes. Richard had never stolen the company outright. Instead, he had quietly managed Northridge Holdings as though temporary authority automatically made him permanent owner. Over the years, he approved investments, sold several properties, purchased others, and transferred income between family accounts. Most of the money had remained within the family. Very little had been spent on luxuries. That surprised me. Rebecca noticed my expression. You expected greed. I did. She nodded. This wasn't simple greed. It was control. Richard had convinced himself that no one else could protect what Arthur built. Year after year, he made another decision. Then another. Eventually, he stopped asking whether he had the right. He only asked whether he thought he was right. That difference changed everything. The court ordered Richard to repay improperly transferred funds, step away from every remaining management role connected to Northridge Holdings, and cover substantial legal costs. No prison sentence followed. The judge found insufficient evidence that Richard had intended criminal fraud when the arrangement began. Instead, his actions became unlawful because he continued exercising authority long after it legally expired. Justice didn't arrive with handcuffs. It arrived through accountability. That felt more realistic than anything I could have imagined. Claire struggled the most. She met Nathan for coffee a few weeks after the case ended. He told me about it later. I asked if she knew. What did she say? She cried. He looked down at his mug. She honestly believed Dad owned everything. Do you believe her? I do. Years of favoritism had protected her from difficult questions. In the end, that wasn't a gift. It was another kind of loss. Over time, Nathan and Claire slowly rebuilt their relationship. Not because the past disappeared. Because they finally stopped pretending it hadn't happened. Lydia sold the old family house the following spring. She said the rooms carried too many unfinished conversations. Before moving, she invited us over one last time. The walls were bare. The photographs had been packed away. Only the grandfather clock remained. I almost threw this out, she said. Nathan smiled. Grandpa loved that clock. So did you. She handed him the winding key. I think it belongs with you now. No paperwork. No signatures. Just a quiet decision. Some things really are that simple. A month after we moved the clock into our home, Nathan asked me to help him clean its lower cabinet. Inside, tucked behind an old maintenance booklet, was a folded envelope. The handwriting belonged to Arthur. It wasn't a legal document, just a short note. Nathan unfolded it carefully. It read, "If you're reading this together, then you chose each other over money. That's the only inheritance I ever hoped would last." Nathan smiled without saying anything. Then he folded the note and placed it back inside the clock, exactly where Arthur had left it. People sometimes ask whether I regret signing that prenup without questioning it. The answer surprises them.
No.
I regret not asking why it existed. Those are very different things. The document didn't reveal who Nathan was. It revealed what his family had been trying to protect. Truth has a quiet way of surviving. Sometimes it waits inside forgotten files. Sometimes inside old recordings. Sometimes inside a company no one understands. And sometimes it waits patiently for one ordinary person to notice the detail everyone else learned to ignore. As a hospice nurse, I spent years watching people wonder whether the truth mattered at the end of a life. After everything our family lived through, I learned something else. The truth matters just as much to the people who have to keep living afterward.